Hello everyone and welcome to the second instalment of the Stonewood Key live webinars. I am joined today by a very special guest. He was the 38th Prime Minister of New Zealand. He's a great golfer and he's also my dad. Welcome, John Key.
First time I've ever heard you say great golfer.
Yeah, I know.
I'm glad you're filming this. I'm going to keep this.
I'm getting paid to say that.
Perfect, thank you.
So today we're here to talk about the OCR, a bunch of property predictions. And I think more than anything, we just want to hear your perspective on everything. You're obviously a leader through the 2008 recession. You were the Prime Minister of New Zealand. You've seen all of this. None of these property trends or things happening right now are new to you. So very keen to dive into all that. I think we're going to touch base on a few other things before we get into the big money question. So I guess where I wanted to start things was keep it a little lighthearted. And I guess the question I get asked the most, probably my entire life, has been, what's it like being John Key's son? And so I want to flip that question on you today, and I want to ask you, what's it like to be the father of Max Key, a property developer?
Interesting. Interesting times. Yeah, interesting. I always remember when I stepped down as Prime Minister, there was a picture that came up and it was you, and it said, famous DJ's father retires.
Yeah, good. I remember that.
So yeah, it was a little different. No, look, I tell you what, you have so far been a fantastic son, and I think look, you've always been that trader. I think you and I sort of share those characteristics where we can see that there's opportunity. We're not afraid to take it. And I think you've always had an interest in property, as indeed I have. I mean, it's always been a bit of a family joke. We'll go on holiday somewhere, and inevitably between the two of us, we're wanting to buy something.
Yeah, buy a house.
Buy a house, yeah. And whenever, without sharing the family secrets, whenever there's disagreement going on, the code frame to sort of, or the code word to end it all becomes, I like houses.
Yeah, I remember that. So,
yeah,
this is a bit of a running family joke. So every time there'd be like a little disagreement in the family and there might have been tension in the car, I'd always interrupt as a 6-year-old and go, I like houses.
I like houses. Let's go forward. Let's move on to a new topic.
Yeah. So as we all know, we're here today to talk about property. And so I guess a good place to start would be kind of our journey of how, I got into property and, kind of what led us to getting into business together and kind of going down this route. And see, I always tell people about the conversation. So I guess my history was I was at Jardine for a couple of years. I did a BCom, BProp at Auckland Uni. So I was always interested in the finance and the property sector. And I remember you sat me down, we're on an OE, we're sitting in Italy, and we talked about getting into business together and, kind of something that we could do as a family. And I guess what would be real great for the listeners is if you ran me through the what you told me about the three kind of different ways people have made money kind of through history. I think I found that really valuable.
Yeah. So I looked at it and said, well, if you go away and look at the rich list of, say, a country like New Zealand, it's really dominated by three lots of people, and I think that's true around the world. So the first is you just got a phenomenal talent at something. Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, you can name the people. And through that skill, they're an Adele, they're Elton John, they have a particular skill and they can monetize that to mind-blowing levels. And, that's out there. It's really difficult, and it's even more difficult in a country like New Zealand where, say, some of our most famous sports people are All Blacks, and they're frankly on a world scale not paid that well for that.
Yeah.
So that was one way. The second way is they establish a business. So think of someone like a Rod Duke sets up Briscoe's.
Briscoe's, yeah.
He's been phenomenally successful, great retailer, made a ton of money, on the rich list at $1 billion. And that is more, I want to say common because there's not a lot of rods out there. But again, if you look at it, there's a lot of those people that have invested in business done phenomenally well. But the third category is property, and it's not third in the rankings. In fact, at the moment, the Inland Revenue Department is going through a thing where they've gone to the 400 wealthiest New Zealanders, and in theory, I don't know how they work that out, we're on that list. And so they are going through a mountain of different questions about assets and trusts and who earns and all this sort of stuff. But what we hear why they're doing that is because they think that a lot of wealth has been created for those people through property.
Through property, yeah.
And so I just remember saying to you, well, look, you've got options. I mean, you could be a DJ, and you might be, Martin, whatever, Garrix.
Martin Garrix, yeah.
So, that may work, but it could be just a really tough life giving out pamphlets at 2 a.m. in Berlin.
Yeah.
Or obviously you could be a finance person, or you could go and set up some other business, but you've got the kind of brain I always thought that worked well in property. We've got the advantage of a bit of capital to help seed that. And bluntly, New Zealanders love property. And I think the way that I would sort of characterise that is if the equivalent of KiwiSaver in the United States is a thing called the 401k plan. And if you go to a dinner party in New York, everyone spends the night talking about their 401k plan. They talk about what stocks you own, what's hot, what's cold, what penny ones have you bought, do you have Microsoft or Apple or Google, whatever. In New Zealand, you go to a dinner party, they just talk about what houses they own and what ones they want to buy.
What they want to buy.
And the only other way you know that is that when you go and have a look at the media sector, particularly the print media, so magazines and newspapers, they're struggling. There's no secret. People are now doing this. They're doing a podcast, or they're doing a bunch of other things, or social media is the way that they're advertising their business. If you go and have a look at, say, election 23, go and look at what National and Labor and Act and spend, and where they spend it.
Yeah, they're spending
online.
crazy stuff.
Crazy money and online.
Well, Donald Trump pretty much won the US election through social media.
Totally, dominated Twitter, got billions of followers, and away he went. But the one thing that sells newspapers and magazines is property. And so I used to talk to a couple of the editors, and I'd go, look, we're just on the front page of the paper every day because either property's going up too fast, it's not going up, it's going down, and it's like that today. And the reason that is, I think, is that you can put people into 3 buckets. 1, they own a property. 2, they want to sell a property, or there might be multiple properties. Or 3rd, they're thinking or dreaming of wanting to do that.
Yeah.
And so everyone's got an interest. It doesn't matter whether it's going up or down. That reflects the nature of the opportunity.
Yeah, because one thing we learned about in our property degree was basically, if you look at around the world, home ownership isn't actually the kind of desired model per se. You look at countries like Germany, and these EU countries, they all rent.
Totally.
And so why do you think in New Zealand, you go to school, the Kiwi dream is, you get married, you buy your first house, like it's all about home ownership. What do you think caused that, or why is that?
Yeah, well, I always used to say we're a property owning democracy. In other words, we were a country of people that own property and we vote, right?
Yeah.
And I think actually the social evidence really supports property ownership. So, and the reason for that is that, for instance, if you own a home, you're more than likely your children will be in a stable kind of environment. It doesn't mean that mum and dad can't split or they can't go in different directions, but they're more than likely to go to the same school, for instance, and not get moved around 10 times and all those different things. And you see a little bit less of it in New Zealand, but in the United States, you'll often meet people and they'll go, I'm from a military family, and that means code for every 2 years they live somewhere different. They moved, yeah. And I think, so I think that's one thing. The second thing is what happens, I think, when you buy property is that you ultimately change your lifestyle. I mean, in many respects, like children. People have children and they say, it's not going to change us. We'll still go out. We'll still do these things. Well, guess what they do? Because kids like routine. Yeah. And if you don't stick to that routine, you pay for it somewhere else. Well, property's a bit like that. What you end up doing is you always borrow more money than you think you can afford and possibly ever should to get in your first home. And when you get there, you sometimes find that maybe Uber Eats and a few cheap beers and wines is your definition of a really good night, as opposed to going out and just blowing a whole lot of cash and buying and spending money on things you don't really want. What
was that for? I remember you guys always tell me the story you bought. Was it your first house in Wellington or?
Yeah, the Hataitai.
Yeah, and you were sitting on the floor.
Yeah, well, we're sitting on the floor. No furniture, basically. Go, what the hell have we done? I mean, when we bought it, we thought, this is just ridiculous. We can't afford this.
So where'd you buy?
We bought it in Wellington, in Belvedere Crescent, actually. Really cool house, actually, overlooking the water. And we put a spa pool in it.
Oh, cool.
And I used to lend it. Mum and I used to go overseas on holidays and stuff. There was a girl in the office who was very nice. She was quite young. And she used to sort of like house sit for us because, we had, I think Oscar the cat or something back then. Anyway, without getting into too many gory details, the day I resigned from Elders Merchant Finance to go up and be at Bankers Trust, it went across the, the wires, all the screens, Reuters and stuff, John Key resigns, blah, blah, blah. And this guy rang up and he said, I'm really interested in buying your house. And I said, sure, mate. Yeah, no worries. Well, I'm going to sell it because we're going to Auckland. So, yeah, well, just let us know and you can come around and have a look through it. He said, mate, I've had sex in your spa pool. And he'd been to the party and at one of the ones that this chicken sort of had. So he actually ended up buying the house. It was obviously a great reference for the property, you know. So there you go. Property takes you in all sorts of places.
No, it sure does. So I guess one big question is that people are kind of worried about at the moment is inflation's going nuts in the country. I guess for some people it would be good maybe if you could in like layman's terms explain like what is inflation, what drives all this, and just your view on that. Yeah, so
in simple terms, if you went to an economist and said define inflation for me, he or she would say too much money chasing too few goods. Mm-hmm. And so by definition, if you have more money than the goods, the price of the goods have to rise because you've got the money to chase it, right?
Yeah, but we want inflation, right?
Yeah.
A small amount.
In principle, a small amount of inflation can be quite good. I mean, what the history of all of this is that the world sort of had inflation and it moved around a bit and it was all manageable. And then the Germans had a patch where they went through this hyperinflation, and you saw it in what was now Zimbabwe, what was Rhodesia. Same thing. And so and you've got it actually, I think, in a few of the Latin American countries.
Yeah, a few of the Latin Americans at the moment.
Have it at the moment. And so what ends up happening is, and this is the problem with inflation, right, is that if you buy a TV and you think that TV costs you $1,000 today, right, let's just argue that. Go to Noel Levy and buy it, cost $1,000. If you think that in 12 months' time that TV will cost $2,000, you'll buy it today. Even though you might have to borrow money or whatever to get there, you will front load your purchases, right? Secondly, the second thing that comes along is you say, well, you're not going to go into your employer and say, oh, it's all cool that you pay me $30 an hour, because that was great when it purchased a certain amount, but when it purchases half of that, because the inflation rate's running at 100%, then actually you demand these pay rises. And you get into what's called a wage price spiral, where they sort of feed on each other. And to a certain degree, you're seeing a little bit of that now in New Zealand. But what happened was from about the 1980s, 1990s, when reserve banks first started getting independence, so they could make that they set the interest rates, not the government. So prior to 1984, government set interest rates.
And was that in the Muldoon era?
Yeah, so Muldoon had New Zealand was a very closed economy.
Yeah, because wasn't everything freezed and you couldn't import and export?
He had a wage and price freeze, wouldn't let anything go up. Look, if you go back and not that far, but the early 80s, I think, late 70s, you actually had to get an import license to bring margarine into New Zealand.
No way.
Yeah, I mean, cars. You couldn't just dial up and say, I'll buy that car on eBay or whatever and bring it into New Zealand. None of that happened.
And is that why we had like the Cadbury factory?
Yeah, well, everything was made in New Zealand because you just couldn't, unless it was made here, really, or you had a license. Yeah. You couldn't, and the big game was get a license. Get a license, you made a fortune, right? So what ended up happening was inflation was this worldwide thing and it went around. And so they kind of around the world, they worked out, well, if central banks have independence and they can raise interest rates irrelevant or cut interest rates irrelevant of what governments think. They can just do it with their own mandate and their own free will. They'll kind of slay the dragon of inflation. Yep. And that's exactly what started happening. So I remember when I first started really working at Bankers Trust, Don Brash was the Reserve Bank governor. And he put up interest rates. I mean, people were bleeding out their eyes. It was so expensive. I mean, people having mortgages at 19%.
Yeah, because wasn't your first mortgage at like
18, 19%? Yeah. It was crazy when you think. I mean, you think about over 5 years, your interest rates are 100% the amount of money you've borrowed.
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening was that inflation dragon worldwide got slayed. And so we went through this period really where there was just no inflation at all. And so we've lived in that. And we've really, if you think about, you're 27, your generation's only ever really seen interest rates coming down.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been periods where they go up and down a little bit, but broadly speaking, they've been on a big trend lower.
Yeah, well, I've got a graph here from the early 2000s And pretty much from 2008 until, 9 months ago, they've literally just come down, other than one minor blip in 2014.
And even before that, really, it's been if you smooth out the bump, the inter sort of year bumps for different reasons, they've just been in a gradual trend lower. And there was a bit of a feeling, I think, a while ago that inflation had gone, that people, because what had driven inflation was the expectations. I mean, if you think that TV that costs $1,000 today will cost $1,000 tomorrow, and in fact actually might cost $900 tomorrow, because technology is driving so much greater efficiency that I'm going to pay less for things, then you don't have that underlying sort of feeling that you've got to go to an employer and say, give me a pay rise simply for that. Give me a pay rise for greater productivity or new responsibility or because of a multitude of other reasons, but not just to keep up with buying groceries, for instance.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you're kind of touching on is if you think it's going to be worth a lot more soon, you want to buy it now. And
Correct.
So it creates that FOMO in the market. And to me, that's what I saw in the last 18 months. I mean, I had friends that had no savings, that weren't in the best jobs, going, shit, I need to get on the ladder. And they were just buying anything and anything. And I think that to me is what, pushed a lot of that, was that FOMO.
Yeah, incredibly low interest rates. So the way to think about that, I'm chairman of ANZ, as you know. And at ANZ, we've got a banking relationship with 1 in 2 New Zealanders. So about 40% of people have a home loan with us, over $100 billion, right? And this is the way that works. If you come into the bank and you say, right, I'm here with my partner and we'd like to buy a property, right? They look at your combined income. Let's say you're a couple. It might be on your own, but let's say you're a couple. And it doesn't matter whether you're married, and actually it doesn't matter whether you might have children or not. They don't ask those questions. The assumptions are that you will actually go back into the workplace, so they don't challenge all that. And let's say each partner earns $100,000 each, just for one of an argument. Keep the math simple. The household income's $200,000, and then they go away and they have what's called basically a loan sensitivity rate. So it's much higher than the actual interest rate you'll pay. It's about 2.5% higher.
Yeah.
And they sit there and they go, that's how much, if interest rates went, let's say from 6% to 8% as a mortgage, that's what you can still afford to pay and not really get in trouble. It's like a buffer. It's like saying, what's the buffer? It's like the speed limit. The speed limit's 100 Ks. But actually the people who model that probably know you can go faster, generally, but they have a buffer in there for keeping the roads as safe as they can. And so that's the way that works. And so what happened was when interest rates were really taken so low a year or so ago through this COVID, environment where the place was flooded with liquidity, what all of a sudden happened was that, you had mortgages down at one point as low as under 2%. But let's call a lot of mortgages at, say, 3%. That sensitivity rate was at 5.5 or 5.5. Yeah. And so that means you can borrow a lot more money. And so all of a sudden, you might conceptually say, wow, borrowing $1 million is a lot. But, if the interest rate's really low, well, it's at 5%, it's $50,000 a year, and a lot of people can afford that.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that's interesting is, everyone sits there now and goes, wow, interest rates have come up so much. They're obviously at 4.25% after that last hike. But, if you look at the empirical data, interest rates have been at that kind of level for a long time.
Yeah.
But I think the big difference right now, and this is what we were talking about at work the other day, is, if you look in 2016, the amount of borrowing you probably had around then was about $500K on the house, at 6%. Yep. Whereas now, most people are borrowing upwards of $1 million on their house. Yep. And it's at 6%. So their borrow cost has just gone through the roof.
Yeah, that's right. So, a lot of different things have happened in there, but I do think that if you kind of take a step back and say, well, what are people trying to do? Well, the answer is obviously trying to get into that property, and bluntly, they'll sort of do whatever they possibly can. I mean, what people don't really fully understand is the base rate, that 4.25%, is called the official cash rate. That official cash rate is set by the Reserve Bank. But that's like saying that's the wholesale rate. That's not the rate.
It's not what you actually get.
No, that's not what. And there are many reasons for that. So people sort of say, oh, well, that's because, the nice ANZ or whatever are making all this money. The answer is that's not really how we're making money. We also have to borrow money when we fund the bank at a margin over and above that sort of set rate. But what has happened is, don't forget that official cash rate was down at 0.25% not that long ago. So it's come very
really
fast.
quick.
Well, I think in US rates, which is called the Fed fund rate, so same thing as the official cash rate in New Zealand, it's had the fastest move up, I think, in 30 years.
Wow.
So these are very, in many sense, very, very big moves. So, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if you go and get a mortgage today, a 1-year fixed rate mortgage is probably in the order of 6.4, 6.5%. A sort of 2 years probably getting close to 7%. So if you came in when interest rates were and we were basically down at say 3.5, 4, we were measuring you at your affordability at 6 or 7. So we were measuring you on what happens today. So that's why people aren't they're feeling it, but we know they can afford it. And equally on the other side, one thing that's been really interesting when we go away and look at ANZ's customers, so it's a big slug of customers, on average we can see that their income has gone up 6.7% over the last 12 months.
So it's moved with it.
Yeah, so they're obviously been paying more for oil and and food and a bunch of other things. But the blunt reality is that, while their interest rate costs have gone up, their income's gone up. The only other thing and this is where things get interesting, is that this is all a lagging indicator, and property is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. So I remember going to Japan in the 90s, and Japan was in this horrendous recession that lasted 20 or 30 years. And there were
Didn't they have negative interest rates?
They still, they've been negative up until very recently. For decades, and did nothing. Did nothing.
Sorry to interrupt, that's the only place in the world, isn't it, where you can buy a house and it depreciates?
Yeah, well, that's been the issue. And the answer is because they've got an aging population and people, and they only really own one house in Japan. They're not
investors.
They go and buy watches.
Yeah.
They buy a house and they buy a watch.
There's this Instagram page, and it's like, my friend was showing me it. It's like cheap houses in Japan. And you can pick up like a freehold house for like $30,000 in Kyoto. Yeah,
well, I'll tell you how nuts it is, right? So the Emperor's Palace, which you've stood and been around, and I've actually with Mum been inside. We met Emperor Hirohito, I think. Amazing place. It's kind of where the royal family live. Yeah. Their palace, which is say a bit like Buckingham Palace, that piece of land was in central Tokyo, was at one point when Japanese property was going through the roof, because it hasn't always been like this. Used to be through the roof.
It used to be like crazy.
It was worth more than the entire state of California. The entire state of California, wow. their house was. So, and their land in downtown Tokyo. Like the New Zealand embassy, I think, sold its tennis court for like tens of millions, in our Japanese embassy. Mm. And I think Australia sold this for over 100 million. Wow. And then the guy could never build on it. There was a problem with the land and he couldn't build. So it was a mess. So,
it's pretty low ROI.
It's not good. So there's gone the other way now. So you've had, but when I went to Japan in the 90s, I was amazed by it. There were cranes everywhere. So they were still building a lot of stuff. It lags. And so and the reason for that is, if you are a bank and you make a loan to a property developer, the only way to get your money out is complete the program.
They've got to finish it,
Yeah, if they finish it, then somewhere along the line they're going to sell it, either to the original buyers or ultimately somebody else that comes along.
And that's the hard thing right now for us as developers. I'm constantly getting asked, how's the market going? How are you seeing things? And, we're talking about this, you and me, together like every night, basically. Yeah. This is the problem is, say, because for 2 years we've sat there every night going, when do we pull pin? It's coming, because as you said, it's a lagging indicator. You could see inflation going nuts. You could see all these other factors that were coming that are going to cause a bubble pop or whatever you may want to call it, or an easing at least. But the problem is, we have an 18-month turnaround by the time you get consent, you build. And so that's where it's tough. I think the position we're in right now, it's like, well, when do we see the market picking back up? Is that in 9 months? And so then you sit there and go, okay, well, if it's in 9 months or a year or 18 months, we have that 18-month lead time. And so I think that's the thing is, there's a ton of developers out there that, they've halved their production line and, they've reduced that. But then all that does is, and so then that just brings supply down. So then in another year, everyone's wanting houses again, but there's no supply because we've all stopped. And then, it's that 18-month jump.
Well, and worse than that. Okay, so if you think about the component parts of a property, right? Land, labour to build it, and materials. Tell me which ones of those are going down. So, yeah, I accept that land prices might ease back a bit because they were overinflated, but they're probably not even going back. I mean, when the ANZ chief economist Sharon Zollner talks about property coming down, she's talking about it coming down off the massive heights that were there. And she's not talking about going back to where it was in 2017 or something.
Nah.
She's talking about that last final, crazy bit that happened at the end,
Well, that's the thing. Even when you look at the charts, it's still basically where we were a year ago, or probably 18 months now. But
yeah, well, she used to get up in meetings and say you probably might fall 15%, and that's called March 2021 or something. 2021, yeah. So, not that long ago.
Nah.
So if you accept, which I think is real, that we've got inflation, so therefore wages are going up, therefore gib boards going up, therefore all these other costs are going up, and at best land might stabilise or go back a little bit. What it shows you is there comes a point where property can't go down easily in New Zealand because replacement cost is what would end up happening is developers would just stop. They wouldn't build because they couldn't sell it. So there's so much sentiment,
But that's the massive question, though, is, okay, I fully agree with everything you're saying because that's pretty much how we've modelled everything that we're doing. But how does it not come down? Because this is the problem. New Zealand, you were telling me the other day, it's like the third highest unaffordability in the world.
Yeah.
How does it keep going? Because there's a point where you might get a 3-bedroom house on 600 squares in South Auckland and it's $2 million. I mean, even the prices now, you sit there and it's crazy. Like, there was a site we bought in GI for 1.1 or something. And the neighbour sold on 150 squares less than us with a giant tree in the middle you can't get rid of for nearly double what we paid for our site. You're talking $2.5 million GI.
Yeah, and some of that's rational exuberance. But the blunt reality, if you look around the world, I mean, you're right. There are many countries where owning a home for so many reasons just isn't valued. And I can't fully explain them, but it's culture in New Zealand, and I don't think it'll ever change.
No.
I just think that we grow up and look, maybe this is not me, but a lot of New Zealand males and many females are practical when it comes to building. I'm the least practical person you'll ever meet. And so what happens is they like the fact that their little investment, their little nest egg for their retirement is a rental property. And we always, when the government gets up in the current world and talks about people who own properties, landlords, and they're kind of quite derisory and negative towards them. Firstly, they should remember that someone's renting that property because they actually need somewhere to live.
Yeah.
But also, secondly, they're not necessarily massive commercial people that own 500 of these. They're actually people that own one or two. And the reason they own it is it's tactile. They can go and look at it. They can see it. They can mow the lawns. They feel like they can add a bit of value to it. And I just don't think that's going to change. But look, I think what will always happen is there'll always be cycles. And at the moment, as we know, a year and a half ago or whatever, it was FOMO, and you go to an auction, it was just ridiculous. I mean, I remember you and I going to auctions, and it started above what we said.
We're like, with no way we'll pay over 1.4, and it starts at 1.5.
I remember at one point I said, shoot me if I put up my hand. And that was above, it started above what we were going to get shot at. It was just ridiculous.
I still remember coming home from that one, and Mum just like, boys.
Yeah, she didn't even talk to us for half of the way on the way home. And then she goes, at what point did you guys think it was a great idea to start 150 grand above where you said you'd never go above? It'll be right. A little bit good.
It all worked out.
And so it all worked out. We came right in the night. And then eventually it goes the other way, right? So at the moment now, if you hear enough times, an economist saying house price is going to fall 20%, and that house that you're looking at is for $1 million, say, if we keep the math simple, then you just go in there and your first bid's 800 grand. And a year and a half ago, it might have been 1.2 because you were just thinking, this is ridiculous, I've got to get in. I'm sick of it. I mean, all the papers were full of young couples crying because they missed out on their 7th auction. Now, they'd be the only person at the auction. Yeah. But it will turn around. And to your point, the lead time is significant. But you will see, I think, structural changes in the market. And I think those structural changes will lead to quite a bit of the sort of product that you have, because I think people will trade land for lifestyle and land for location. So what they'll end up saying is, look, yeah, of course I want to own a quarter acre section in Parnell or Remuera or whatever St Heliers, and of course I want to, have a big area for the kids to run around and a dog and everything else. But you know what? That costs so much money. That is not practical for your first, maybe second, third, or ever home.
Yeah,
and
the upkeep on that's crazy.
The upkeep's crazy, and also it's just the capital cost. They can't afford it. So they'll end up, I think, a hell of a lot of young people will start in something like you're building, for instance, out in Westgate, where it's it's in that sort of 800 to 950 sort of market. It's 3 bedrooms. It's got a garage. It's great. It's a great place to live. It'll be a fantastic little property. The probability of people making money, you've got to say, you'd think over time would be very high. The upkeep's low, and they're in a great location. They can afford to be where they are, and I think, and that's what you've seen internationally. So when people talk about the international property markets, they gloss over the fact that if you live in Hong Kong, you're in an apartment. If you're in Brisbane or Melbourne, you're in an apartment. I mean, the big developers, and we bank a lot of them at ANZ. In Australia,
they're all apartment guys.
They're massive apartment guys.
Like Harry Triggoff and stuff.
Yeah.
He's Meriton, right?
He's Meriton, yeah, exactly, yeah. And he
owns like 60,000 apartments or something.
He is an incredible story, Harry. So Harry came, I think, as a very, very poor guy to Australia, no money.
He's from Croatia, right?
I think so. So yeah.
Somewhere in that.
Yeah, Eastern European, somewhere along the line. Came along and essentially just started, basically investing in property, and he got to the point where he just didn't sell, and he just, obviously built a thing and rented it all out, and then borrowed money against it, and carried on, and now he's got 60,000 apartments. It's $1 billion of rent.
Yeah, his rent rolls like $1 billion or something.
$1 billion a year.
Not bad.
Amazing story. But I mean, that's the point, though, isn't it? There's so many stories if you look around in New Zealand. People like Michael Friedlander, who's made huge amounts, way north of $1 billion. I mean, the Mansons, it just goes on and on and on. And even people that have been amazingly successful, maybe in the earlier thing they did, have more
transitioned into property.
Yeah,
I don't know how many of like the people you've introduced me to, where you talk to them and you're like, oh, so like, what did you do? And, they start off and they've had some amazing business, and they're all commercial property guys, or they're all property in some way.
And because most of them are of reasonable vintage, they've all seen it before.
Yeah.
And, one of the guys I played with the other day, he was very famous in the 80s in New Zealand. And they've got a pretty big property development business. Actually, he has it with his son. And he said to me, he's in his mid-70s, and he said, Tom and son play golf for a year, but it'll all come back. And they've just seen it all before. They've seen the cycles. Because
I remember you
life
telling me
always goes in cycles.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that story about Michael Friedlander, and he didn't do anything for 7 years.
7 years. That's what he told me once. He sat in his hand for 7 years.
Yeah.
So,
because that's one thing I found tough about transitioning from finance to property. Is, finance is bam, 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 bam. It's now, hit the bid. And then, you move to property, and it's like, I think that's my advice to people, is that everyone's sitting there, freaking out about the small minor adjustment. But I think the narrative we're trying to portray, and everything you're telling me and everything I've learned through, what you've told me and kind of what I've seen in the industry, is it's not something you try to do as like a quick flick. And I think all the people that tried doing that, I heard so many people, you'd be out and they'd be like, oh, I'm going to buy this house. It'd be November. And they're like, I'm going to flick it in Feb and make 50 grand. To me, I was just sitting there going, this is so reckless. Every single time I see you and we have a chat about what I'm up to and this, you always go, oh, yeah, mate, it's a 40-year game.
Well, it is. It's a 40-year game.
Thing. It's a long-term thing. We're not in this to try and make a buck overnight.
But also, people are very convenient at sort of banking all the profits and telling you the good stories and ignoring everything else. If you were an owner of Facebook shares, Meta, they have cratered.
Yeah.
They're down 65%. If you own Zoom's topped out at like $500
bucks or something.
$580, I think. I think they're like $80 today. And you just go through them. I mean, huge numbers of these stocks in the US are down 90-95%, let alone Bitcoin, let alone everything else. So the point is just that, property is pulling back a bit. We accept that off these extreme highs, right? But is it going to? Is anyone seriously saying it's going to halve? Well,
something
I
really
don't see it.
Something really interesting. Just before this podcast, I was looking at our good friends Opus Partners. They they have heaps of good stuff, so go check them out, guys. A little free plug there, Andrew.
Yep.
But we were just checking their thing out, and they posted a thing that it compared the 2021 average house price and the 2022 average house price, and it just went through everything. So you've basically, on average, lost 65 grand, roughly, was what they said. And your deposit, has slightly gone up because of the increase in interest rates.
Yep.
And your deposit's gone down, but your interest rate payment's gone up. But even with all the negativity in the market and everything, you're only paying $160 more per week off the top of my head, and you've lost 60 grand since the peak of last year. And this is the worst it's been.
And very few people would have bought at the absolute peak. Yeah. And that's, you can look at that as say in any other alternative investment class, from assets to
Well, my share
to
portfolio is getting hammered.
Well, my KiwiSaver got hammered.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it turns up on my ANZ Go Money app, so I get to actually witness that on a
watch
daily
it live.
basis. Let alone everything else. At least I try and turn a blind eye to stuff that's on the Excel spreadsheet. But
Logging into my shares is torturous.
Yes, that's not exactly fun, is it? So, yeah.
I'm lucky I'm colourblind because there's a lot of red. There is a lot of red.
See, that's the point. But also, I suppose if you take a step back, isn't it? I mean, ask yourself these sort of basic questions, right? Will we go away from being a property-owning democracy? Well, I don't see it. No. I think that's cultural and it runs deep.
It's
right?
so deep. I mean, it's the first thing you learn.
And what the bank of mum and dad? Yeah, okay, except your bank of mum and dad is overly generous in my opinion. But parents do ultimately, if they're in any position to be able to do so, will help their kids to get into a house because they themselves know that the house that they're probably living in, they bought for a fraction of what it's worth today, 30, 40 years old. Secondly, what do you think is going to happen to the population of New Zealand? Because here's a clue, it isn't going down.
See, I just saw an article, just to play devil's advocate, that they think population growth in New Zealand could decline.
Well, with the greatest respect to the current government stays, and it might, because people can leave and go to Australia. But everyone's got a free option.
Friends have left.
Yeah, but actually, under normal circumstances, there is there's significant, huge demand for people to come to New Zealand, and we normally have proper migration settings which allow people to come in. And those migrants, what do they want to do? Man, the first thing they want to do is buy a house. So
it'd be cheap as well with our dollar right now.
Yeah, I mean, do you really think that Auckland is going to be the home of whatever it is today, 1.4 million people or something? Do you think it's going to be that in 30 years? Not a chance.
No way.
So I mean, everyone's got to live somewhere, and you can work out whether it's owned by the state or it's owned by someone else and rented, and it may vary a bit. But I tell you what's really interesting. This is stuff we see at ANZ. A third of New Zealanders own a home, no mortgage. Third of New Zealanders own a home.
So is a third no mortgage?
No mortgage. Yeah.
I thought it was like 5%.
No, a third no mortgage of our customers, ANZ customers. A third own a home with a mortgage. A third rent.
Interesting.
So 65% of people have a home, and it just varies. And you see, the other thing with a home, right, is that what isn't overly developed at the moment in New Zealand or worldwide really is negative equity, right? Sorry, not negative, reverse mortgages.
Yeah.
So what I think is going to happen in years to come is people will go along and you see it all the time. Grandma's 80 and she's asset rich because she owns a house in St Heliers and it's now worth $4 million or something crazy. She's cash poor, right? Well, I think they'll just go along and say, yeah, well, Granny, go on that cruise and do all these things and don't sort of, sort of starve yourself of the nice things of life in your last, 10 years or whatever you've got. Go and draw $500,000 on the property, and when your grandkids get to sell it one day, they're still probably going to get $4 million because it will have gone up by that or more.
So much, yeah.
And you'll have the cash. So we tend to think of it as a sort of very stationary thing, and it's a bit the point you actually made earlier. You were sort of saying about how people changed, the amount of deposit versus the amount they pay. One thing we saw a lot at ANZ was when interest rates came down, our customers increased the amount of payments that they made. So they say they were paying $1,000 a week. They just paid $1,000 a week, and if the bank rang up one day and said your mortgage has gone down because interest rates have gone down, so you only owe us $800, they still paid $1,000. Yeah. They just paid their principal off faster, and now they're going the other way.
Yeah. It's an interesting balance, whether how you structure those payments.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like anything in life. It's like, it ultimately does come down to affordability. And no one's arguing that at the start it's not a stretch. And look, there wouldn't be a single person on the planet, I reckon, who buys a house and walks in their first home and goes, oh, goody, we paid too little. Everybody thinks they paid way too much.
You paid too much and you sold it for too little.
Well, have you ever noticed when you go to an auction and you're buying, you're always convinced you pay too much of anything.
Always,
and when you're the seller, it's all of a sudden miraculously a terrible market.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's because you alter your expectations. If you went to that auction thinking, I'm going to sell my house for $1 million, because you have some pumped up view of it, but 2 weeks earlier you probably thought 900 was great. If you get 975, you're disappointed. But 2 weeks earlier you would have been happy. And it's the same the other way around. So it's not a perfect science. It's a long-term game. Totally.
And one thing I guess you've taught me, and this is what I've taken into my business, not sure if it translates fully into home ownership, but I think, the principle's the same as, I think what you've always instilled in me from day one is you have to be unemotional with capital. Yep. And you always tell me the story about, you didn't hit the bid quick enough on something, and where you taught me was, so basically in February, I'd just finished a development on Richardson Road. We got offered a bid that was probably a little lower than what we'd wanted. It was still pretty good. And you were just in my ear like, mate, hit the bid, hit the bid, hit the bid. And I remember sitting there and we ended up doing it. And I remember sitting there and I was a little bit gutted because, you get the images, you're like, oh, if I make this much, I can buy this. Or, whatever's going through your head. But I remember sitting there being like, oh, damn, like that didn't go to plan, because you get it in your head. But now, had we not hit the bid, God, it would have been way worse than that. And
And you sort of, it's a funny thing, isn't it? In fact, the weird thing is you do it and you don't feel great about it. And then a couple of days later, you actually do feel better about it. It's really funny, eh?
Yeah.
You're out and you move on. But that's the point, is that, look, I always used to say, capital isn't patriotic. It flows to where the return is the best. And you have to be, as you say, totally unemotional about it and make kind of rational decisions. And I remember I was on a call. I advise obviously a number of really big companies around the world, and one of them is BP, a massive oil company these days. And the CEO was right at the start of COVID, and the CEO went. He's got 3 advisors, and we're doing this general chat on thing, and the board were there, so there's a whole lot of people on the call. But he eventually went to the 3 advisors and he said, "Okay, tell me the one piece of advice you're going to give me as CEO." And he said, "I'll start with you, John." And I said, "It's a fortress balance sheet." I said, "It doesn't matter what you lose money on or what you gain money on, what you think you could do better or worse. If you don't have your balance sheet in the right place, that you can't fight another day, at some point your luck will run out and you're toast."
Yeah.
And that's,
you tell me that every day. It's all about fighting another day.
It is. Yeah. Because to go back to my other little thing, it's a 40-year gig, right?
Yeah.
So, you're 27. You'll probably, if you love this and you seem to, be doing this when you're 67. And you'll be laughing about the decisions you're making today because you'll be thinking, oh, they look also uncomplicated compared to whatever development's happening then. But it is ultimately, if you get yourself in a position where you're so leveraged, then all of a sudden, it's like they say, if you borrow $1 million, you've got a problem. If you borrow $1 billion, the bank's got a problem. Well, that's sort of a bit true. But equally, if you have borrowed so much money, then you can get carted out because very small movements make that difference.
Yeah, it's all leverage.
And that's why banks have what's called a loan-to-value ratio. So they generally say, we'll lend you up to 80% because we know under normal circumstances, a property going down by 20% is a huge fall and pretty unlikely. And all we're trying to do is keep you in the game.
Then what would you tell someone right now that, say they rushed into something last year, their mortgage has gone up a lot. What would your advice be to them? Obviously, you can't give them.
Well, I mean, basically would be don't panic. I mean, firstly, it's like anything in life. I mean, I have a bunch of different shares, and some days they go up and some days they go down. And if I'm really honest, the days they go up, I hit the golf ball a little bit better and feel good.
You also call me about it.
I call you about and tell you, send you a little WhatsApp picture of 1 or 2 of them. And if they're going down, it's the other way around. I don't necessarily send you the picture. But actually, it's all irrelevant unless you're selling or buying on that day. It doesn't matter. Now, it's easy to say it doesn't matter, but the truth is, okay, maybe if you had to go and sell that property in a forced position today, would you get less than you would have a year ago? Yes, in all probability. But will you, when the day comes to sell it? Probably not. In fact, if history would show you, there's a very good chance you'll do better. So
I've got one big question then. So say you're 28, you're a couple, you're looking to buy your first home, or maybe you're 35, maybe you're 40, who knows what the age is. But you're walking into your first home and you're sitting there, all these terms like the mortgage, the LVRs, all this sounds complicated, and you've worked really hard, you've saved a deposit, and you're looking at the market right now and you're going, oh God, like what if I lose my money? Which obviously, you're not going to, but what would you say to someone like that? How would you advise them to go into it? How would you, would you tell them to, not borrow the most that you could,
Yeah. Well, what's the basic rules of engagement? I think the first thing is, look, okay, you have to be able to sleep at night. So everyone's pain tolerance and risk tolerance is different, right?
Yeah.
But if you take a step back, just go through some basic equations like, how likely is it, do I think, that my income will dramatically either go up or down from the position I'm in? How likely is it that my partner's income will go up or down? So say, for instance, you're a young couple, you're 28, you're thinking about having children, and your wife or partner says, look, if we have a baby, I'd like to have a year off and then I might go back to work and I'd like to work part-time, or I wouldn't like to work at all, for instance, then you know that that's quite a big adjustment made potentially to the household income. So you need to think about that. So the first is just be a little bit realistic. I think the second thing is there just comes a point at some point where this whole process is kind of full of delights at the end of it when you eventually get there, but you just got to understand it's going to feel a little bit difficult. But I think that as long as I would look to borrow. Frankly, you probably have to borrow pretty close to the max if you're, unless the bank of mum and dad are really there for you, or you've very high paying income. The reality is you probably are going to be maxed out on your mortgage, but on what you can borrow. But one interesting thing is, well, which way do you think the cycle's going? Because we can get to interest rates later, and they may move up a bit more, but my point is, when they were at 1/4 of a basis point base rates, the official cash rate, tell me which way it had to go, because maybe Adrian Orr as Reserve Bank Governor could have made it go negative, but not for very long not very far, right? So therefore, like if the All Blacks win 113 games in a row, what do you reckon is going to happen at 114? At some point they're going to lose.
I remember you and me since June 2020, every time I was like, oh, Dad, I'm going to go buy the site. You were like, oh, is it coming? Like, we, for 2 years, have been predicting this. Yeah, and it did take a while, but it eventually got there. And we saw, I remember when we looked at that place in, you obviously bought and sold and different things around, in St Michael's and that area, Point Chevalier. But remember that one we looked at, and at one point you were a little bit keen on it, and I said, this is ridiculous. Langery Bridge.
And no, the one that was sold in the main road there, it was sold for ridiculous
it was on Point Chev Road.
That was crazy,
It was insane.
Yeah, that was insane.
It sold for nearly $3 million.
Yeah, it was tiny.
620 squares or something.
Tiny thing, yeah. So that even we sort of looked at it and said, if you measure life in upside or downside risk. But I reckon if you looked at it today, if you went in there today and said, okay, well, interest rates might go a little bit more, but I'm young and I've got all these things and there's a little bit of headroom, would I be terrified of buying at the moment? I don't think I'd be terrified. And I think, and actually bluntly, there are going to be some developers that they just need to recycle the capital, or they need to pay back some investors, or they need to pay back the bank. Actually, there's some good deals out there, and there will be good deals,
Yeah, well, we were in a board meeting the other day, and we're definitely looking to buy soon. So
yeah.
One question that I really want to touch on while I've got you is, you obviously became Prime Minister in 2008?
Yep.
Or was it 2009? No,
2008.
2008. And I guess in that period of the world, it was similar to, I guess, the last kind of 5 years where you had this crazy tech boom. The banks and the financial institutions, especially in America, were pumping liquidity into the market. And the market was just going crazy up until 2008. And obviously you kind of walked into a bit of a hospital pass. So I guess for starters, what was it like being PM through that time? And, you've obviously seen, obviously COVID's a whole different beast, but you've seen, it's the same iterations, it's just in a different
same
language.
principle,
Yeah. So I guess from your experience, what's going through your mind right now, and how did you tackle '08?
Well, firstly, you can generally see these things coming, right? There's a bit of it doesn't quite work in the digital world, but there's a bit of a saying that, a stopped watch tells the right time twice a day,
Yeah, true.
and it's kind of true, isn't it, And so there are people who make their name by just being really negative, and they just say Armageddon's happening. The massive, global depression's coming.
Well, that's like the guy in The Big Short. He was like the only dude that predicted it. Now he's like, obviously you got it right.
Got it right, yeah. But if you say that every single day, at some point you're going to be right. But I had this feeling, and you could sort of see it from 2005 on, where I didn't probably fully understand it in the same way, but these, subprime mortgages and all that sort of stuff, all those kind of really fandangled sort of crazy things that made no economic sense. Bluntly, they wrote mortgages and lent money to people. They lent them over 100%.
Yeah,
people had
zero
no
equity,
job,
no
zero
job.
equity, no job. I mean, give me a break.
And then that's CDS it to like the investment banks who buy it.
Yeah. And in the United States, they have a very different model. In the United States, you can just toss the keys at them and it's totally their problem.
Just done,
So if you've got no equity, why wouldn't you do that deal? And so that led to this crazy rational exuberance. And what happened was we probably didn't fully understand how bad that was. But then when long-term capital basically looked like it was blowing up and the banks all got together, I was still when that one happened, I think, in the financial markets, and we got called in at Merrill Lynch. It was really ugly. And then years later, obviously, it was Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and all this sort of stuff. And, I tell you how bad the banking crisis got. I mean, Citibank shares went down to $5. Prince Awaleed, who we met, obviously, in Saudi Arabia a couple of times and still texts me, actually, he ended up buying a gazillion Citibank shares at $5.
Wow.
And Bank of America, who for years wanted to buy Merrill Lynch, eventually bought it, and at $50 or something went down to $5, and nearly the CEO got fired, and everyone got carved out. So, but you could see that crisis for a couple of years beforehand. And I think actually in a lot of ways, I always say to people, one of the reasons they elected me as Prime Minister, I don't think they actually really knew me in 2008. I was still relatively new. I'd been in Parliament for 6 years and been the finance spokesman for about a year and then opposition leader for 2 years. But what happened was Labor would get up every day and they'd call me a fat cat. And at one point, Michael Cullen said I was singularly responsible for the global financial crisis, which was kind of a cool thing to have, but not true.
Badge of honour.
A badge of honour. And then, but the more the public heard that, they just heard, I think something bad's happening and this guy's good with money, so hopefully he'll be good with our money. And that's why they elected me. And I think there's a lot of that happening at the moment there. I think that people are starting to look at someone like Chris Luxon and say, he's good with money, he's been a great CEO, and actually this is what the country needs. So,
well, that's what you always told me, because I remember I always sit there with you and I'm like, but how do you spend the GDP? Like, it's so confusing.
It's very confusing.
But then you sat there and went, mate, it's just like a big company, effectively.
It's like a household. Look, if you spend more than you in one day, you got to basically pay back. And I remember not that long ago, the government was borrowing unbelievable amounts of money. And I said to someone, well, one day that's going to be really, really ugly. And they just basically said, oh, you don't understand, John. Interest rates are way different from your day. They're so small and this is costing nothing to fund. Well, guess what? The average duration of borrowing for the government is 7 years. So, by the way, when we go to renegotiate that debt, it's going to cost us one hell of a lot of money. So it's not... And that's why when you're Prime Minister, you don't want to speak to people, because people can't understand billions. They don't know what multi-factor productivity is and all this sort of nonsense. And half the people who use it don't understand it either. They just want to sound cool.
Well, that's the problem is the media will post things and be like, they spent $7 million on this. And it's like, okay, yes, $7 million is a lot of money to you and I. But to a GDP, it's like
it's not.
You dropping 10 cents.
Yeah. GDP's $350 billion or whatever it is. So, they're spending, the government spends about 40% of that. So they spend, a huge amount. They spend about, $100 billion or something. Yeah. So, I mean, look, the simple bottom line is I think you can generally, they used to think on average a recession happened every 10 years. So that's my point. You're seeing this now, But if you're a long-term property developer and long-term property guy,
Might be 4 more.
you might see this 4 or 5 times. And so what was happening was a lot of the stuff that was happening when we were doing things in the early COVID and all that sort of stuff was, I just thought, this is crazy. This sort of escalation doesn't make any sense and it can't be backed up. But I guess initially I just underestimated how much these very low interest rates really pumped up the volume. And
one thing that I find super interesting that you and me talked about basically was that, the government brought in these OIO rules, and said, in layman's terms, they basically said foreign buyers can't
buy.
Super difficult to buy. And that was to stop, they had this paranoia that first home buyers were getting, priced out of the market, no one could buy. And that by doing this, it was going to make everything more accessible. But we're talking about this today, when we're planning this. What's super interesting is that they've done that.
And you're the biggest increase in house prices New Zealand's ever seen.
Had. And that just shows that interest rates is what's driving prices.
Totally.
It's not foreign buyers.
It's the cost of money, exactly. I mean, how many people do you really think wake up one morning in Beijing and get a pin and they just stab it on the map?
Throw the dart.
Stab it on the map and go, Auckland, you're up. I'm buying a house. Never been there, never seen it, can't speak English, don't know anything about it, but I'll have one. It just
Give me 2.
It doesn't happen, eh?
I'll buy the street.
Yeah, I'll buy the street. So, and that's the thing. You hear the stories of, so-and-so came into town, he bought 50 houses and, probably started that he bought 3. And there are people that come in and do that. Or there were people that did that. But, a lot of that stuff is over-exaggerated. So, foreign buyers in some markets like Queenstown are a bigger influence because there are more Australians or Americans that want to buy there.
Well, that place is definitely more boom-bust.
Totally. And it's also driven off that. But as a general rule, are they going to Glen Innes or Pakuranga or Mount Roskill to go and buy property? I don't think so.
No. Not on mass scales at least.
And it's so foreign buyers bans don't do anything. They do, and internationally they've had actually, funnily enough, capital gains tax have less impact than people might think. You think they would. What they do is they stop people selling actually because they're a realisation tax, so you pay them when you sell it. But look, I think in the end it comes down to the cost of money and people's capacity to actually pay it. Because if you go back to desire, we'll go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What do people need? Shelter is right up there, eh?
Yeah. Well, shelter's number 1, isn't it?
Yeah, shelter, food, water.
Health.
Yeah. So, and I don't think that's going to change. And I just think so. So I think, okay, it might adjust and it'll move around a little bit and it doesn't mean that some property companies won't get carted out, and it doesn't mean that there won't be some cheap deals and all of those kinds of things. But I just think that overall, do I think house prices will one day be higher than they are today? I would bluntly bet my life on it. But I just don't know when that day
That is. And do you see the bubble bursting in some big 30% drop, or do you see
I don't, because I think if you think about where interest rates can go from here, they can certainly go higher, right?
Yeah. Well, they're at 4.25 right now.
Yeah, well, but if you think about it 2% higher, just say you go and borrow that money. Even when people borrow fixed in New Zealand, the bulk of them borrow 1 or 2 years, right? Yeah. And so you're about 2%. So say a fixed rate mortgage is about 6.5%. The question is, well, can they go a lot higher than that? Maybe a bit. I mean, certainly our economist believes that those official cash rates go from 4.25 to 5.75, so that's another 1.5%. But they've come from 1/4 to 4.25. So quickly, they've had a much bigger part of the move already there. The other thing is that one thing that's really interesting at ANZ, of our customers who have borrowed for a home loan, up until about a few weeks ago, 57% of them still had a mortgage that either had a 2 in front of it or a 3 in front of it. So they're going to have to roll off very soon, right? In the next 6 months. And when they roll off, they're going to roll off in something with a 6 in front of it, right? Maybe even higher. So you can't tell me that isn't going to have a dramatic impact on people's capacity to go out and buy everything from pizzas to a new frock, right?
So what do you think happens to the market as a whole? Because obviously that impacts property, but...
Well, property's what's showing up as at the moment, because what's happened is that was the thing where rational exuberance was taking place, where it was just completely overdone and people were just going, this is crazy, right? But actually what might end up happening is it has a bigger impact on other items. and people just can spend less, and ultimately that's what really slows the economy down, and that's the challenge for the Reserve Bank. Can they eventually stop the economy from getting into this inflationary cycle? And the answer is yes, if they have a recession. But if you look at property, when we look at recessions, we look at property at ANZ, there's only two things we worry about. Do people have a job, and how much are they paying for the money? And you see at the moment, unemployment's down at 3%. Well, when I came in Prime Minister in 2008, the Treasury, the first thing they told me was they expected unemployment to peak at over 10%.
It was double digits, right?
Yeah, over 3 times what it is today, 4 times probably what it is today. Now, I don't think you see anything like that in New Zealand, going forward. I think maybe it rises a bit. Maybe it goes to 3.5% or 3.7%. Maybe a few people get laid off. But I don't think it's anything like that. So
it's impossible to hire people at the moment.
Well, that's right. And I mean, is that going to dramatically change? I think COVID's actually taken people out of the workforce.
Yeah.
So I just wonder whether to really, really, really get the property market to really crack, you'd have to have interest rates going through the roof from here, and you'd have to have labour markets going through the floor. And we do all of that stress testing of our balance sheet at ANZ. And even then, we see property prices down, obviously from where they are, and pretty significantly down. But that's Armageddon.
That's Armageddon.
That's Armageddon.
Well, and that's the thing that everyone doesn't realise is since New Zealand does have such high property ownership, prices went down another 30%. It's not just developers everyone's going broke at that point.
Yeah, or alternatively, no one sells and everyone just sits there and pays the mortgage and weathers the storm.
So what's your outlook on the next 12 months?
Well, economically, I'm a bit negative. And if I'm really honest, I was negative 2 years ago and wrong. So I just thought when COVID came along, I just couldn't visualise a world where you're an airline like Air New Zealand with 0 passengers and somehow you could come out of this thing alive. And truthfully, I was right. I mean, they went from being a massively profitable company to losing $1 billion a year. I just couldn't imagine how a pizza bar or a restaurant or a bar, anything could survive when you had no patrons. But of course, what I underestimated was the level of government transfers. The government just basically pumped money in. And I think the Reserve Bank printed $91 billion of cash and flooded the system with cash.
Wow.
So it was huge, relative to the economy, $350 billion economy. So they flooded the place with cash. So I think myself, what happens now is that because inflation's here, governments can't spend as much, and actually the Reserve Bank actually has to do the opposite. It has to tighten interest rates, not weaken interest rates, and lower them. And therefore, I think you will see the economy slow down over the next 12 months. We will have a recession of sorts. I don't think it's a horrific recession, but I do think you will see, by definition, a recession is 2 quarters of negative growth, and I think you'll see that. But I mean, longer term, I'm still massively optimistic about New Zealand. We produce food and fibre in amazing quantities, and China's our next door neighbour and still wants to buy a huge amount of our product. And you can go through it all. Tourism's re-emerging, and we're still a fantastic place to visit, and we're a young population. And
what would happen if China shut that gate, though?
Well, yeah, China's a problem for the globe, right? Because in 2008, they always used to talk about the 3 legs of the stool, which was the United States, which is the biggest economy in the world, Europe, which collectively is also a very big economy, and basically Asia, but the proxy for Asia was China. And China was what got everyone through the 2008 recession, global financial crisis, because its balance sheet was in very different shape. What's different about China today is that zero COVID's having really quite a big impact on their economy. And I think that's why you're starting to see them, as of this week, they're actually reducing the COVID restrictions in China,
because they're still crazy locked down.
They have been, but I think they've got through their party Congress, and you've now got a lot of political pressure, and you've seen some riots and protests for the first time. So they're starting to change. And I think by the early part of next year, Q2 of next year, you'll be able to travel back to China.
Yeah.
Secondly, they've got problems in their property market. They've got a really weird property market, but in their property market, if you're a developer and if you're a purchaser and you buy an apartment off the plans and it's due to be finished in a year and a half, even if it's not finished, you've got to start paying the mortgage. It's the craziest thing in the world. So they do have a lot of problems in that regard. And systemically, long term, their problem is that they've got an aging population, believe it or not. They had a one-child policy for a long period of time. And guess what? They've got less young people coming through.
And apparently now they've all realised that having one child's better.
Yeah, well, they're encouraging them to have two. They're actually paying them to have two now. Yeah. I think it's nuts. But anyway, but I mean, having said all of that, so China could be a bit of a drag. Funnily enough, actually, I wonder whether China is going to have quite strong economic growth next year. And I'll tell you why. They've got quite a command and control system because they don't have a democracy, so they can do what they like. And I think that you will see the government working pretty hard to try and deal with those property issues. I think they're coming out of lockdown, and what did we see in every country in the world that came out of lockdown? People went crazy. They spent money.
Feel like free.
And interest rates are low. So I think China might actually have a better growth. It might surprise them the top side of growth next year.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're at just over an hour already, so should probably tie things up soon.
This is the longest conversation we've ever had
this is the most
without
I've seen
me
you
talking about helicopters or golf. You're going to say this is the longest you've seen me?
Seen you in 27 years.
It's like, Mum, we were married for 38 years a few weeks ago, and she said, yeah, but you've only been home for 8 of them.
8 of them.
And 2 of them were because Jacinda locked you into the house.
I remember when we had that first
but true.
lockdown, and I was like, who's this guy?
Who's this guy?
All right, so the big question, and this is probably why everyone's online, where do you see the next OCR going, the next OCR raise?
Well, interest rates are going up, and they're definitely going to go up. So our economist thinks that they go 75 basis points in February and then another 25 and another 25. And that takes the OCR from 4.25 to 5.75. And that would take a fixed mortgage up to
close to 8%.
Close to 8%, and floating, believe it or not, to 10%.
Maybe double digits, yeah.
But this is what I think. I think that the Reserve Bank might be underestimating, the impact with all of these people who are currently paying 2.95 or 3.25 come off and have to renegotiate. And I think they might be surprised that, with labour prices going up so much, some employers are just going to say, look, we just can't afford actually to pay, a barista $30 an hour, so we're just going to have less of them. And
I remember I used to work at McDonald's, and my minimum wage was like $10 or something. Or no, it was
less than that, I think.
I think it was $8. Yeah, by the time I worked like an hour, I couldn't even afford a Big Mac combo. It was horrible. Now it's like 25.
Firefighters just got 24%, I think.
Yeah,
I mean it's a massive pain.
Well deserved, but mental.
Yeah, well deserved, but mental. Yeah, so it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a big increase. So I guess the point is, I would not be surprised if the official cash rate tops out at less than what our economist thinks, and maybe a little less than what the Reserve Bank's saying. And if you buy into that proposition, then there is a chance, isn't there, that we're sort of 1% from the top.
Yeah.
Now,
wasn't there? I remember reading in like an eco journal. There's 3 ways the the Reserve Bank can affect inflation. And is it jawboning or there's something?
Yeah, jawboning is when you say I'm going to. It's like that's the equivalent of saying I'm going to ground you if you go out. It's jawboning. Like a bluff. I'm probably not going to do it, but I keep telling you I'm going to do it.
Yeah,
like when I told you if you got a tattoo, I would disinherit. You would be out of the inheritance.
I've told so many people that if I get a tattoo I'm off the will, they're like, "Nah, it's bullshit." I'm like, "No, you've not."
Probably was, but I wasn't happy about it. But your sister got one.
Yeah, she's got a few. All right, well, John Key, former Prime Minister, father, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Now, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. This is one of many Stonewood Key webinars to come. We're going to get Dad back on at some point. He's always got a few yarns to spin.
Yeah.
Guys, don't forget to check us out on our social medias. It's all Stonewood Key. We post a heap of instructional videos, heaps of developments going live, and we're always here to help. And thank you so much, guys, and thank you, Dad.
No problems, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, guys. We'll see you soon. Cheers.